about to begin the inaugural session of the two-day seminar on Ezekiel. I invite Professor Bhavan onto the stage, who is going to deliver the inaugural address, who will inaugurate this seminar. Professor Bhavan. I also invite Professor Malashri Lalji, convener of Sahitya Akademi's English Advisory Board. I request Dr. K. Lalji, Secretary Sahitya Akademi, to please join the guests. And yesterday to our seminar invite, Padma Bhushan Jatin Das ji responded so warmly, and he is with us. His email was about his long and close association with Nissim Ezekiel, and he specifically talked about the particular group of which he was a fellow poet of Ezekiel. Madhav Kaushikji, President Sahitya Akademi, could not make it because of his health issues. So I request Dr. K. Lalji to formally welcome all the guests. First, Padma Bhushan Jatin Das ji. Professor Bhavan. Professor Malashri Lalji. At the outset, I thank Professor Malashri Lalji, convener of the Akademi's English Advisory Board, and the rest of the members of the board for recommending to organize this significant seminar on Padma Shri Nissim Ezekiel to celebrate his birth centenary. Ezekiel was a distinguished Indian English poet, actor, playwright, editor, art critic, and translator. Born on 16 December 1924 in a Jewish Bene Israeli family, he studied English at Wilson College, Bombay, and philosophy at Birkbeck College, London. As editor of the Quest and Poetry in India, he encouraged a generation of poets. He was a professor of English at the University of Bombay and was a visiting professor at the University of Leeds in 1964. And in 1978 was invited to read at the Rotterdam International Poetry Festival. His works include A Time to Change, 60 poems, The Third, The Unfinished Man, The Exact Name, Snakeskin and Other Poems, Hymns in Darkness, Latter Day Psalms, Collected Poems, and 3 plays, Naveen, Marriage Poem, and The Sleepwalkers. His collection of poems, Latter Day Psalms, received the Sahitya Akademi Award 1983. Incidentally, the Marathi translation of this collection, Adhunik Stotra, by Pradeep Deshpande, received the Sahitya Akademi Translation Prize 1995. Ezekiel was honored with the Padma Shri in 1988. Together with A.K. Ramanujan, he invented the idiom and metric of post-independence Indian English words and is often considered the father of modern Indian English poetry by many critics. After a prolonged battle with Alzheimer's disease, Ezekiel died in Mumbai on 9th January 2004. He was 79. At this seminar, we are here to commemorate him and explore his impact on Indian poetry in English. I now request Dr. K. Srinivasarao to welcome you all.
Morning and Namaskar. Professor Malashi Lalji, eminent scholar at the convener of Sahitya Akademi's English Advisory Board. Professor Nilufar Borichaji, scholar and co-director of Mumbai University Institute of Advanced Studies, University of Bombay. Respected Dr. Jitin Dasji, eminent poet and artist. And Subrahmanyji and all the participants of this seminar and friends. I'm glad to welcome all of you for this today's seminar on Nissim Ezekiel and his impact on Indian poetry in English to commemorate the birth centenary of Nissim Ezekiel. Friends, poetry, the efflorescence of the soul in beautiful expression, has been with humanity for a very long time. India has produced great poets in many languages, each unique and special in the given cultural setting. All these poets have enthralled millions through their immortal creations, soothed many a wounded heart, gave wings to the hopeless, provided voice to the voiceless, and essentially, the poetry by such poets have beautified and decorated hearts of the countless. But there are poets who shed light in the dark areas of our lives, bring to life even the remote and inexpressible thoughts that adamantly refuse to yield to any expression whatsoever and generally widen our horizons. Then there are poets who make us wonder what is poetry, who is the poet, the relationship between the two beyond the obvious substratum, substance, matrix, and over the above, reshape, redefine the frames of workings of poetry, and also give new direction to the genre itself. If one looks at the Indian English poetry that is part of the topic of this seminar, the names of Sri Aurobindo is bound to come to everyone's mind. He is fearless when it comes to expressions and put Indian English literature as a separate genre in the global literary arena and also set the bar very high for all those who came afterwards, who engaged in poetry criticism as well as poetry in Indian English. I'm not saying this because the occasion is the birth centenary and probably it may appear to be an exaggeration to some. I dare to say that only Nissim Ezekiel scaled the bars that Sri Aurobindo set when it came to criticism of poetry and writing poetry. There have been many who have received great plaudits and laurels when it came to poetry in many languages, and rightly so, but it is criticism of poetry that requires not only a vast mind but also vastness of the heart. Nissim Ezekiel's critical evaluations betray in full extent the depth of his understanding of poetry, breadth of his scholarship, and vastness of his mind and heart. Very impressive thing about the thought and philosophy of Nissim Ezekiel is his rootedness, and it is amazing that he comes up with very apt view that he boldly espoused. With the combination of extraordinary poetry, knowledge base, and a critical scholarship, Nissim Ezekiel provided a new direction to Indian English poetry in the post-independence India. He was one critic with original insight, gift to connect things, and clarity of thought at all times. I guess integrity comes up somewhere in that sphere, and the combination ensured that there is no lowly and elite in his world. Nissim, the critic, would reflect and come up with a genuine answer irrespective of whether the question was asked to him directly or not, or whether the question or issue or idea came from a scholar or uneducated. It is usual for commoners like me to think poetry most of the time is imaginative. Unlike many theoreticians and scholars, Nissim Ezekiel strikes right at the center of the truth. Experience is the most important and only thing that matters for a poet. Language used may be what you and I use, but good poet dances in the gap between shadows and the light, if such an analogy can be used, especially at the seminar like this. While he rejected versified knowledge as superfluous as knowledge and superficial as a verse, he encouraged all of us, or rather nudged us to see poetry as knowledge. He was a man of deep insights, and he was deeply aware of many facades in the world of poetry and the impertinent traditions that mushroom out of imaginations and falsehood. To have a knowledge of a field or a physical substance, etc., is one thing, but to express it with clarity is another, and Nissim Ezekiel was the master of the latter. So, what is the standing of poetry as an art form? Let me quote him. I quote, "Poetry as a propaganda is equally suspect. The surrealist movement in poetry, claiming to arrive at the truth by using atomic modes of writing derived from the alleged workings of the unconscious, failed miserably to produce much poetry with staying power. Marxist poetry is more Marxist than poetry. Drug-induced states of mind in which the consciousness is temporarily expanded and intensified have so far not produced any notable poetry. Poets who have mystical experiences and project them in words have occasionally been successful, but mystics who write poetry do it badly. Religious hymns, however notable the religious sentiment they express, are not notable poetic. Great religious poetry undoubtedly exists, but the greatness is unequally divided between the poetry and the religion, while perfect integration between the two is rare. To be good, poetry has to be an independent art." Unquote. This quote is from Nissim Ezekiel's Poetry as Knowledge, that was edited by S.K. Das and G.N. Devi, in a book called Critical Thought. One can go on and on about various aspects of Nissim Ezekiel's aura, and that is a pretty vast landscape, like the interplay between poetic imagination and thinking, the role of metaphors, symbols, and images in poetry, revision of a poem, Indianness of Indian English poetry, etc. That is like enveloped in the entire frames of references of a culture of a given society with sweeping mind under one porch. Friends, we are very happy to organize this seminar to commemorate the birth centenary of Nissim Ezekiel, and we have tried to cover all these topics and more along with the readings. And Sahitya Akademi, India's premier literary institution, organized commemorative seminars on the works of Bhavan from other areas as a way of saluting their rich contributions. Another objective of this is to bring knowledge about these distinguished minds within the field of awareness of the current generation. I sincerely hope all those who are attending this seminar stands benefited. With these few words, I am glad to welcome all of you once again. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. I invite now Professor Malashi Lalji to make introductory remarks. Malashri Lalji is a writer and academic with 21 books to her credit. She retired as professor, Department of English and Dean of Colleges, University of Delhi. Her publications include The Goddess Trilogy, co-edited with Namita Gokhleji, In Search of Sita, Finding Radha, and Treasures of Lakshmi. A volume of poetry is Mandalas of Time. She currently a member of the General Council and convener of the English Advisory Board of the Akademi. She was a senior consultant to the Ministry of Culture and has served on International Book Awards juries. Professor Malashri Lalji.
Good morning, everybody. It is with enormous respect and gratitude that we remember Shri Nissim Ezekiel today as we celebrate his birth centenary and thank him for his resonant poetry and the new directions that he initiated in Indian poetry in English. I quote a few lines from Latter Day Sounds, the book for which Nissim Ezekiel received the Sahitya Akademi Award in 1983. And here are the lines. The sea is his, we may drown in it. He formed the land on which many millions thirst to no end. Ezekiel here is almost prescient about the ecological disasters to come. Here the contrast between land and sea and the contestation between nature and human beings is given prominence. In the vast corpus of his writing, the poet was constantly sensitive to social change and literary developments, and as we know, he ceaselessly experimented with the English language. The seed of transformation in English studies in India, I believe, is embedded in Nissim Ezekiel's first significant book titled A Time to Change in 1952. That is, soon after India's independence. It's a writer's assessment of how people, culture and literature, among other aspects of the new polity, will alter in an independent country and forge its own future. Perhaps Ezekiel was not consciously or theoretically being a post-colonial thinker, but in hindsight, one can see him carefully building an Indianness to the subjects and the language that he introduced in his writing. That Nissim Ezekiel succeeded in his aims can be seen in the 2 poems that are widely taught in Indian school and college syllabi, The Night of the Scorpion and Goodbye Party for Miss Pushpa T.S. But I won't dwell on those because I have a feeling the seminar speakers will bring them up. But there's a delightful play on English, both humorous and ironical, available in less known poems, of which I want to quote one. It's called The Professor. And it's a portrait of a retired elderly man who declares quite pompously, and I'm reading the lines from Ezekiel, whole world is changing. In India also, we are keeping up. Our progress is progressing. I'm going out rarely, now and then only. This is the price of old age. So, along the way, the politics of language will change how one reads these poems using Indian English, but the lines will remain imprinted in the history of Indian poetry in English. My next point, Nissim Ezekiel also wrote extensively about urbanization, Bombay being his home and his workplace. It was a fraught relationship with the city that several of his contemporaries and younger poets have also picked up. So much so that the maximum city continues to have its own stamp in literature and cinema even today. I'm reading a few lines from Ezekiel's poem called Urban. At dawn, he never sees the skies, which silently are born again. nor feels the shadows of the night recline their fingers on his eyes. He welcomes neither sun nor rain, his landscape has no depth or height. However, for Ezekiel, it was never a parochial Indianness. He was part of a global literary fraternity where Indian poetry in English came to be recognized for its unique contributions. The remembrance of this phase will come up in Kavita Ezekiel Mendonca's interview, that's Ezekiel's daughter. It is part of our seminar program and it's a recorded interview. And she talks here of a forthcoming book in which the memories of the Bombay poets associated with Ezekiel is recorded. I just mentioned a few names: Salim Veerabina, Deep Patel, Adil Dasawala, and Jerry Pinto. Fortunately, Jerry is with us. Next, I wish to think about Nissim Ezekiel as a rooted cosmopolitan. A person of Jewish origin and fully aware of the minority status of the community, he never homogenized the country or its people. Ezekiel was a liberal thinker, and I have a few favorite lines to quote again. And here are the lines. It's not the mythology or the marriage customs that you need to know. It's the will to pass through the eye of a needle to self-forgetfulness. The poem is from a collection called Minority Poems. In conclusion, the program Nissim Ezekiel and his impact on Indian poetry in English will explore diverse talents within one writer and also offer varied perspectives from those who have read him, teach him, and think about him. Although the beginnings of Indian poetry in English may be located in Toru Dutt, and certain developments in the writings of Michael Madhusudan Dutt, Sri Aurobindo, and Sarojini Naidu, a major shift happened with Nissim Ezekiel's modernist, post-colonial voice entering the arena. Moreover, it's apparent that his influence is visible even now in the diverse explorations of poetry that is prolific today. Poetry was a genre which could not find publishers or readers, but poetry today is the favored form. Sahitya Akademi recognizes the current moment of poetry and the history etched by Nissim Ezekiel and welcomes all the speakers and the audience members to the Centenary seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Manasheji. I request Professor Nilofer Baruchaji now to inaugurate the seminar with her address. Professor Baruchaji is co-director of the Mumbai Munster Institute of Advanced Studies, University of Mumbai. She is a member of the Sahitya Akademi's English Advisory Board and is Faculty Associate Emeritus, South Asian Studies Institute, University of Fraser Valley, Canada. She was Head and Senior Professor, Department of English, University of Mumbai. Her current research interests are focused on literature and cinema of the Indian diaspora, law and literature, and writing of the Parsis. She has published widely in these areas in India and abroad. She is a creative writer and has published several short stories. She also translates poetry and fiction from Gujarati into English. She has been a visiting professor at universities in Europe, the United States of America, and Canada. She has also been a member of international research projects at European universities. She has received several international professional awards and been on juries for literature awards. Please welcome Professor Nilofer Baruchaji.
Good morning, everyone. And at the outset, I would like to thank the Sahitya Akademi for giving me this opportunity to pay my tribute to Nissim Ezekiel. So I'm going to talk about him And as I have entitled my talk today, I've said Nissim Ezekiel recalled to life, borrowing of course from Charles Dickens. I've had the good fortune of knowing Nissim Ezekiel in several capacities. First as a poet, I read and admired at school and college. Then as a professor when I was a student at the MA course of the Bombay University, and finally as a very dear friend. As a professor, Nissim had endeared himself to our students by his quirky and unorthodox ways of teaching, which included the then very unusual manner of perching on top of the table or a bench while lecturing. I do believe that many of us had opted to study American literature in those days, mainly because it was taught by Nissim. This again was an unusual trait, students using his first name to refer to him instead of as Professor Ezekiel. When I joined the Bombay University faculty, I got to know him as a senior colleague, who though retired by that time, still taught at the MA course as a visiting professor. What also pleased me very much then was the fact that I had been allotted the room that used to be Nissim's office, and it was a proud privilege for me to work at the old wooden table that used to be his. Nissim used to wander into this room almost as a matter of course, before or after his classes, and join me for endless cups of tea I used to make for him, as well as relish the batata vadas I would order from the university canteen. In this love of chai and batata vada, he was a true Mumbaiker. He was what Salman Rushdie used to call himself, a Bombay boy. Having said this by way of a personal introduction to the subject, I shall now try to contextualize his life and different aspects of his poetry into the 100 years that we are celebrating today. Nissim was born on 16th December 1924 in Bombay. His parents were educationists. His father, Moses Ezekiel, taught botany at the Wilson College, and his mother was the school principal. The Ezekiels were Bene Israelis who belonged to the ancient Jewish diasporic community which had settled on the western coast of India centuries ago. Young Nissim had studied English literature for his BA at the Wilson College and had done an MA in English literature from the University of Bombay. After completing his BA, Nissim had taught English literature first as a tutor in Wilson College, and then after finishing his MA as a lecturer for a year at Khalsa College. After dabbling in radical politics for a while, he had sailed to England in November 1948, where he studied philosophy at Birkbeck College, London. Nissim has very interesting things to say when I had interviewed him for the Fest shift he had brought out in his honor in 1998. He had talked about this whole issue of how he had been funded on this trip to England by Al-Ghazi, and it was very interesting, his memories that he had when he spoke about this at the interview. Anyway, coming back to what I was saying, after a 3.5-year stay there, he had worked his way back home on a ship. He married Daisy Jacob in 1952, and they had 3 children, Elkana, Kalpana, and Kavita. Kavita, I understand we are going to see and hear in a little while from now. Nissim began his career as an advertising copywriter and then as a manager of a picture frame company. From 1961 to 1972, he headed the English department of Mithai College in Bombay. He joined the Department of English, University of Bombay as a reader in 1972 and retired as a professor in 1985, a long tenure. As we are being told by Mr. Gimbalne and I think Mr. Srinivas Rauji, he also founded the Quest in 1954, co-founded the literary monthly Imprint in 1961, became art critic for the Times of India, edited Poetry India. He also edited the Indian PEN, official organ of PEN from the All India Centre, Bombay, which was located in the Theosophy Hall at New Marine Lines. During this period, he also held visiting professorships at different universities. Collections of his plays were also published during this time. He also presented, which is not very much known now, when we used to be Bombay Doordarshan, not the overall national DD, but Bombay Doordarshan. He had held a series of art programs. He had done a series of art programs for Bombay Doordarshan. Nissim, as Malashri has just said to us, is one of the most studied and critiqued Indian poets in English. His poem Night of the Scorpion is used as study material in Indian schools. Ezekiel also wrote poems in Indian English, again, to quote Malashri. I think there has to be some degree of repetition in what each of us is saying about Nissim. So there are several poems that he has written in Indian English, like the one based on the instruction boards in his favorite Irani cafe. Don't comb hair, don't sit long, don't do this, don't do that. His poems are prescribed in English textbooks at Indian universities. He may also be said to have started a school of poetry for his influence on younger Indian English poets, who he nurtured in his role as an editor of several journals, such as the Indian PEN, and as poetry editor of the now defunct Illustrated Weekly of India, which obviously, by virtue of its pan-Indian reach, had an immense impact on readers around India. As the critic Bruce King has said, and I quote, "Of the group of poets attempting to create a modern English poetry in India, Nissim Ezekiel soon emerged as a leader who advised others, set standards, and created places of publications. He did set very high standards." His collections, which we have already heard about from Mr. Bhavan, starting with the 1952 Time to Change. Again, he had an interesting story to narrate in his interview about how this publication came to be, how he had no money to get these poems published, and then a friend with whom he boarded in London forwarded £20. £20 was a lot of money in 1952. Forwarded £20 for the publication of this collection, which was published as he had boarded the ship on the way back to India, and he received the copies of his first collection once he had reached Bombay. All his collections stand testimony to the man's conscientious attempt at perfecting his craft in the context of his chosen linguistic medium, a fact that bears witness to also his almost religious faith in poetry. Not only serious scholars, but every dabbler or student of poetry would have thumbed at least some of the pages in his collected poems 1952 to 1988. Nissim was honored by the Sahitya Akademi in 1983, as we have just heard, for the latter-day Psalms, by the President of India with the Padma Shri in 1988, and by the Bombay University or Mumbai University with a Festschrift in 1998. Nissim is rightfully accorded the status of being the progenitor of the school of modern Indian poetry in English, a post-colonial poet who had personally witnessed the history of change in that order. All his poetry displayed a certain elegance and mental agility. But personally, I think that it is in the poems written in the 1980s that we have some of the best examples of his sharp wit, sophisticated irony, and brilliant quality of mind. I'm referring here to his latter-day Psalms and poems 1983 to 1988. It is not possible to classify his work as a romanticist or a classicist, as he scoffed at those terms. Yet it is possible to consider his poetry as both the poetry of the mind as well as of the heart. His poems of the heart are concerned with the diverse women in his life, mainly about other things as well, but he's written a lot about the women in his life, from the woman he married when quite young to the other women from different parts of the world he loved throughout his life. This was an aspect to his character he never tried to hide, even in a conservative, moralistic society like India. He was open about these relationships and wrote about them candidly in his poems. As for the poetry of the mind, several critics in India and from abroad have commented on this. We have K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar, who has commented upon the lucidity and craftsmanship in Nissim's poetry, while our friend Anisu Rehman has focused on the inextricable nature of form and value in his poems. Lawrence Joff, in his obituary to Nissim in The Guardian, has summed up his poetry as that which, I quote, described love, loneliness, lust, creativity, and political pomposity, human foibles, and the kindred clamor of urban dissonance, unquote. In the latter-day Psalms, you have the sharply ironical, almost tongue-in-cheek poverty poem about the foreign tourists and Bombay beggars, as well as the poem The Counsel for Hariji Who Said It, which is a good example of the poet's criticism of blind religious beliefs. There are many others in this collection. Sri Hariji speaks in riddles and offers platitudes and placebos to his disciples. I quote, "Whether you believe or not, think as if you do," unquote. In one of the poems from the Edinburgh interlude section of the poems 1983 to 1988, Nissim has written of the social customs in a poem called Dead End Story, and he has mocked at literary festivals with which the audience here is quite familiar in the poem Nothing to Say. In Dead End Story, he writes of the mother-in-law who tries to appear modern and says to her new daughter-in-law that she needs no help in the kitchen from her, but then complains to her husband and his son, saying that girl is no help to me in the kitchen, is she? And the father-in-law then says to the new bride, "You must try to understand." And the husband says, "If you quarrel with my mother, you quarrel with me." In the poem Nothing to Say, which is about literary festivals, the Edinburgh Festival in this case, he writes of the poet who goes to many such literary festivals, this time in Edinburgh, where I have nothing to say. But once he comes back home, gratefully and persistently and poetically as the grass that grows between Bombay's pavement tiles, he keeps talking on and on about his role in the literary festival. As for Nissim's love-hate relationship with the city of birth, it is as much of the mind as it is of the heart, and the city runs like a thread through these cerebral poems too. The city of Bombay features in Minority Poem, in the poem called Minority Poem. As a Jew, Nissim was a minority in the city, and this, rather than his Judaic origins, is what is at the forefront here. As he himself has reiterated in his interview with me, which I've just spoken about, anti-Semitism was something not to be found in Bombay or even India as a whole. However, minorities, linguistic, racial, religious, or on the basis of caste, have to tread carefully. So Nissim has written of the uneasy orphan of racial memories himself, the little Jewish boy, who needs to, and I quote from his poem, "polish up your alien techniques of observation while the city burns," unquote. These lines, I think, foreshadow what had befallen the city in the dark days at the end of 1992 and the beginning of 1993. In this sense, Nissim is a poet who was definitely ahead of his times. If this be as the poet of the mind, as the poet of the heart, it is not merely about the young girl he had married and the various women from around the world he had loved, but also about the city of his birth, his Wordsworthian Lucy, aesthetically deflected here also to reiterate the idea of singing the city in which he had lived and died. In the poem Jewish Wedding in Bombay, he narrates the tragicomic tale of two young people, not too well versed in love or sex, getting married according to all the required Judaic traditions, who had then felt truly married according to the Mosaic law. The marriage ceremony was then almost of necessity, followed by the consummation act, described in Nissim's trademark deadpan style. I quote from the poem. We lay on the floor mattress in the kitchen of my wife's family apartment, and though it was past midnight, she kept saying, "Let's do it, darling, let's do it, darling." So we did it. If this be the comic aspect, the tragic one could be, quote from the remainder of the poem. During our first serious marriage quarrel, she said, "Why did you take my virginity from me? I would gladly have returned it, but none of the books I have read instructed me how." Unquote. Was he being lewd? Albeit his candidness notwithstanding, was he voicing private concerns in public spaces? Was he saying things just to shock? Was he being patriarchal? Definitely not, as asserts Sridhar Rajeswaran, a fellow traveler and poet, who says that patriarchy is too big a term, and such condemnation, of course, is unfair condemnation of Nissim. As for revealing intimate details, perhaps all may not do it. I might not do it, you might not do it, but he was not being hypocritical. Nissim, according to him, reminds him of the postmodern poems of Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Allen Ginsberg, for instance. We had someone speaking already of Nissim and postmodernity, although he used to froth at the mouth when he spoke of postmodernity in general, but he was definitely postmodern in many of his ways. I refer to the songs he written for his pop singer, actor, nephew, Nandu Bende, which in their style are very postmodern, very resistance writing. As for me, these poems are the stories of the comic and tragic elements that are part of life. Here I would like to also refer to the set of exquisite 14 sonnets called News from his 1978 collection, in which Nissim has explored the distinction between nude and naked. The sixth sonnet in this grouping leads the reader from nakedness to nudity. I quote from the sonnet. At first the difference did not interest me at all. Was she naked? Was she nude? The pathos moved me. I touched her feet in worship, held her breasts in adoration, told her she was beautiful, and led her there from nakedness to nudity. There's also the sensuality sonnet, which is the fourth in this group, and which I think is a miniature opus. I quote, "Sensuality, a word that stands by itself, or rather lies down and stretches out. You listen to its melody, sensuality." The graphic play with the word sensuality, which Alice has also referred to in his writing, which is stretched out across the page, conveys a languorous and almost tactile feeling to the reader. The love-hate relationship with the city of Bombay in this collection of poems is most clear in the poem Island. And if you permit me, Mr. Kimbamne, can I read from the Island? All right. Unsuitable for song as well as sense, the the island flowers into slums and skyscrapers, reflecting precisely the growth of my mind. I'm here to find my way in it. Sometimes I cry for help, but mostly keep my own counsel. I hear distorted echoes of my own ambiguous voice and of dragons claiming to be human. Bright and tempting breezes flow across the island, separating past from the future. Then the air is still again as I sleep the sleep of ignorance. How delight the soul with absolute sense of salvation? How hold to a single willed direction? I cannot leave the island. I was born here and belong. Even now a host of miracles hurries me to daily business, minding the ways of the island as a good-natured ship, taking calm and clamor in my stride. Those of us who have been or are natives of Bombay would know exactly what Nissim has said in this poem. One of the most endearing qualities in Nissim was that he adopted as his crucial role in life that of a mentor. In the course of this detailed interview which I had conducted with him, I had asked him why he felt so committed to helping young poets. And Nissim had responded by saying that when he had been a young poet in London, he had known two types of editors. Those who rejected your poems outright, and the second type who said he didn't like your poems, but he would like you to go over and discuss them with him. And it was then that I had decided, Nissim said, that I would one day do this for other young poets. And I would not stop doing this. I'm not going to stop doing this, and I don't consider it a waste of time. Nissim had battled Alzheimer's disease from the mid-1990s onwards. In the beginning, his increasing forgetfulness was brushed aside by all who knew him as part of his quirky personality. By the late 1990s, he was finally diagnosed with this cruel disease that attacked his fine mind and wiped it almost clean of all memories. But the poet in him, I think, still lived almost till the end. I don't know whether Jerry would agree with that, but I do think that the poet lived there somewhere in that broken mind. Whenever I visited him in the hospice where he had been consigned, he never failed to ask me about my students and wanted me to send him any budding poets, as he called them. He didn't remember my name, but he knew my face and he knew of my connection with the university and the students I had were budding poets. Some of these budding poets did visit him at the hospice, yet really smuggle them in as visitors were not welcomed or encouraged. Some of them did visit him and came away awestruck by a still brilliant analysis of their poems, and of course a still intact caustic wit. If they visited him again, he would not remember them or their poems, but the flashes of lucidity continued almost till the end. Sadly, he couldn't attend the release of the Fest Schrift we had brought out in his honor in 1998. I conclude now. Nissim Ezekiel died in Mumbai on 9 January 2004, aged 79, and was buried in the Jewish cemetery on Dr. E. Moses Road in Mumbai. At the funeral, the audience was fewer than expected, but select. After a brief hiatus, the broadsheets and tabloids in Bombay, as well as literary journals around the world, came up with a series of obituaries celebrating his life and poetry. In an early poem, Nothingness, Nissim has said, I quote, "At last I have been reconciled to simple nothingness. Who beside the final void would analyze his errors? Time, the great consumer, cancels all." Unquote. However, I do believe that Nissim hasn't been forgotten. We are all here today talking about him. He hasn't been forgotten and he hasn't been reduced to nothingness. The fact is that he will be remembered and maybe even loud every time a school-going child reads The Night of the Scorpion or a student of literature studies his island or background casual. Nissim Ezekiel, the man, the poet, the human with many facets, part of history of modern Indian poetry, he has, as W.H. Auden had said of W.B. Yeats, become his admirers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Parucha. May I now invite Padma Bhushan Jatin Das to share his views.
Nissim was a very close friend of mine. I grew up in Bombay, and I recall his thin, gold-framed spectacles and tight lips, almost like he was tall, but like Al-Ghazi also had similar tight lips. Reminiscing and recollecting the early days in Bombay is like yesterday, and I've been in Delhi for 56 years from Bombay. Although he was much older than me, we were very, very close friends. I had a studio in Bulabai Memorial Institute in Rabindra, which is now known as Bulabai Desai Road. His house was there on that road, and I had a studio in 1959. Bombay was a unique city in the country where we didn't think of Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, anybody. And where you lived, in the posh area or some suburb, it didn't matter at all. It of course changed immensely thereafter. In my early days, as I'm reminiscing and recollecting, Jason Mikuna, K.C. Gavran, Nissim Ezekiel, Arun Kolarkar, Dilip Chitre, all these museum used to come to Villa Naidu and Gummorais and met him first there, Mr. Pinto. And I did many portraits of these friends in Bombay, and the oil portrait of Nissim in 1968. Bombay was a unique place. I studied at the Sahitya School of Art, which had a campus for applied art, architecture, art, and craft, everything. A unique concept of institution, art institution in the country, which was not replicated elsewhere. So when we met in the canteen, we met architects and applied art students and everybody. I had a first exhibition in the applied art section. They opened the gallery in JJ in 1961, where Nissim came and reviewed the new times of India. Nissim visited Bulabai Institute almost every second day because we lived just about 5 houses away from there. I don't know where to start, but it's all mixed up and jumbled up. In Jahangir Art Gallery, there was a cafe, a restaurant called Samovar, which doesn't exist anymore. On Sundays, we had a group of poets who used to meet: Nissim Ezekiel, Arun Kolarkar, Dilip Chitre, Arvind Krishnan Mehrotra, R. Bhattacharya, Deep Patel, and me. And we had no outsiders, only us. And one evening or one afternoon, one poet will read his poems, and then we discuss about them. And our Bhattacharya got them cyclo-style. There was no photocopy then. And the poems were distributed between us. tangent, I'll tell you, I went to Pune after 45 years and I had a presentation. And Dilip Chitre was sitting in the front row before anybody else arrived. Dilip Chitre was also a famous poet in Marathi and in English. And I come back to Delhi and I see in my bookshelf a plastic bag which is full of dust. So I dust it off and open it. Then I found the poems of Samovar all in it, including Dilip Chitre's. So I got the poems to 11 sets, photocopied in color, and bound it and gave it to all the close friends of the poetry group at the period. Dilip is gone, Arun Kolakar is gone, Dilip Patel passed away recently. Well, I'm not talking about his poetry, I'm talking at the time and the period that we lived in. And there was nothing like older, younger, or caste or creed. There was fantastic, if there was a poetry reading, everybody would be there. Meaning people from art, from theatre, from dance and music, and vice versa. So, Nissim was the critic of Dance of India. At that time, Linda S. came to Bombay and she was a student, in Elphinstone College, opposite Gallery. And they got friendly. And then when Linda went to US back, Linda is still there. Our Partha-Sarathi, the other 2-3 people are still there, including myself. Linda has in the US, our Partha-Sarathi in Saratoga University, and Arvind Vishan Mehrotra in Dehradun. You know, I must say to Sahitya Academy, when you have a function like this, there should be all the colleges, departments should be informed of it. All the students should be here. If we carry food to the new person, it's of no consequence. All of you know Nissim and others, that is Centenary. And say for instance, I hope you don't mind my interference or suggestion, saying the resume of everybody should be on a tray at the entrance, so we don't waste time. All over the world now, they put the resume there. We talk about the subject, we don't talk about each other. So that is what, and then my request was, if the students of various universities were invited, then this seems all books should have been there at a discount for purchase by young poets and all of us. This is just a simple suggestion and a proper board outside. So somebody may be passing by and see who was today's Nissim Ezekiel, I'll go across. Okay. Now, returning back to Bombay, you see all those here, they all from the English poetry. In Bombay days, we had theatre, music, painting. If I attended every Alkazi's plays, Satyadeva plays, Bina Chitri's plays, you know, in Bombay. And vice versa, and dance and music and everything. It was a fantastic period. Then there's a fellow in Calcutta. You know, when Nissim was in Bombay, like many others, and there was P. Lal in Calcutta. There was Keshav Malik in Delhi, you know. And this is the portrait I did in 1968, you know, of him. And I've got portraits of many artist friends, many poet friends. So the 3 academies are housed in this building. And I wish there was a library, which could be a big library of dance, music, theatre, painting, all be partitioned but be together. And a discount for professionals, you know. And these are little suggestions I have for you. And today, this is Centenary thing. We should have had all these books reprinted and available for acquiring this one. The other thing is, when we in Sahitya Akademi makes publications, it should be done in million copies. Each one of these books should go to every library in the country, in schools and colleges. With a discount, when we print a large print order, like in Russian art books, they are printed in millions. They are available for little price here. So my request and suggestion is how to reach out to the listener. And I don't think the young people, the young poets don't listen at all. When Nissim went to America with Linda Hess, Deep Patel was then a student of medicine and lived in Kolaba, was a very dear friend of mine. And then he became art critic of Times of India. And then when he went for medical, what is called profession training, his lady friend, what's her name, used to study in the Centenary College. She became the art critic. That's her. And then Vasu was a critic of Times of India. Then Jagmohan was the art critic of Times of India. And it was very unusual that all those who all taught English literature, they became the art critic of Times of India. And eventually this happened. The point is, when Gaitonde was a famous artist, and so was Sousa, F.N. Sousa. When they died, there were 8 or 10 people in there. Nobody knew. And they are selling at high price, they are all talking about it. What my concern and request to these noble institutions to reach out to the educational institutions and to bring out publication in large quantity so that individual price comes down, let go. I have at least 60 portraits of poet friends. So if the Lalit Kala Academy and Sahitya Academy and Centenary Academy, since in the same building, the Rabindra, there could be portraits done by many other artists, which could be on the wall, they could be printed, they could be reprinted and sold at a low price, like in National Gallery, etc. And only just to say that Bombay was a very special period in my time, where writer, poet, painter, musician, architects, we all shared with each other, we all attended each other's function and activity, and this is what very dear to me. Thank you.
Time for an autobiography to be written. Write that autobiography.
Yeah, bring it.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your fond memories of Nissim, and thank you also for your suggestions. We will now have the segment titled Memoirs from a Daughter. Here, especially for this seminar, Professor Malashiji interviewed Kavita Ezekiel Mendonca, Nissim Ezekiel's daughter. We will have it on screen. I'll introduce Kavitaji. In a career spanning over 4 decades, Kavita Ezekiel Mendonca has taught English in Indian colleges, AP English in an international school nestled in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains in India, and French and Spanish in private schools in Canada. Her poems are featured in various journals and anthologies, including the Sahitya Akademi Journal, Indian Literature. The 4 issues of Yearbooks of Indian Poetry in English, Verse Virtual, the Madras Courier, and the the Auditorium poetry journey, among others.
Hello, good morning, Rabindra.
Good morning, Manashri.
It's a great pleasure to meet you across the world, in Canada and I'm in Delhi. So thank you very much for agreeing to this interview, which we are showing at the Centenary 7th Hour of your father, our very respected and dear Nissim Ezekiel. So this is our conference which is titled Nissim Ezekiel and its impact on Indian poetry in English. And you're really the best person to set us off on this journey of looking back on time and also discussing how his impact has been not only on poetry but also on your own poetry. So let me begin first by expressing my deep appreciation for the book titled Nissim Ezekiel, Poet and Father, a centennial celebration that you have compiled and edited with Inaugural. And the dedication to the book actually cites a very moving old man in Ezekiel, where he says, when eyes are open, let me see, let words be intimate with brain, and let the road, the house or tree not stroll across my life in vain. So can I ask you, Kavita, what was the driving energy for putting the book together?
Before I respond to your questions, let me thank you, Manashri, for giving me the privilege of speaking about my book, Nissim Ezekiel, Poet and Father, which is the title, compiled by me and edited by Vinita, and to be published by Pikaran Books in early August 2024. The book is purely a labor of love, and the words I wrote have flowed freely from my heart. 2024 is the birth centenary of my father. As his daughter, I would not let the year be simply another date in the calendar. I wanted to do something to celebrate and honor my deep bond with him, and thought of paying tribute to him by bringing out a book. I had to do everything in my power to preserve his legacy, not just as a great poet, but as a beloved father who had the strongest influence of anyone else in my life. I thought that bringing out a book to celebrate his life that was dedicated to the literary community in India and beyond would be a fitting gesture. I also wanted to set the record straight about a few things I read in the so-called authorized biography, which I now had time to read more thoroughly. This was important to me. A friend on my social media platform had once written to me, "You should write the true biography." His words had been ringing in my ears even while I was teaching full-time in Canada. That gave me further impetus to express the truth as I knew it intimately. Asking fellow poets whom he mentored and friends, students and family to share their memories of him would form an integral part of the outline I first made for the book, as would my poems and interviews about him. The poems dedicated to him always come naturally. I went ahead with the book, receiving full support from my husband.
So thank you very much for that very moving example and memory of what impelled the book. In your introduction, you have a poem which is titled "Waiting for Daddy." And you also say elsewhere that he was a larger-than-life character with all the lovable yet bewildering eccentricities of a man single-mindedly devoted to his quality. Would you like to elaborate on those beautiful words? And rather intriguing words, actually.
Like the poem, my memoir bears the title, Waiting for Daddy, as I explain in the writing of it, and in real life, how I've waited for my father in so many ways. For his step on the creaking wooden staircase, for him to ring the doorbell and affectionately call out my name, Kavitam, for him to come home with a packet of peanuts wrapped in a cone-shaped newspaper, and for him to let me enter his heart as I stood and waited for him to finish working with poets at the pen office. To keep the lunch and tea appointments we often made, I also wanted him to get some rest. But most importantly, I waited for him to come back to the family so we could all be together again as we were meant to be. The Cambridge Dictionary describes larger than life as, if someone's larger than life, that person attracts a lot of attention because they're more exciting or interesting than most people. Dictionary.com defines the phrase larger than life as exceedingly imposing, impressive, or memorable. By describing him as larger than life character, I meant he was a huge presence not only in my life but also in the lives of so many poets, artists and writers in India and all over the world who were drawn to him. He was completely lovable. I wouldn't want him to be any other way, yet eccentric in how otherworldly and impractical he was, and sometimes with the decisions he took about how to spend his time and money. I mentioned in the memoir how it was sometimes difficult or challenging for us as a family to understand him. Often I think God made him in a different mold. So many writers and artists who are single-mindedly dedicated to their work neglect their families, not deliberately, but for their complete and utter devotion to the call, to their call. My father was not an exception, yet we missed him in our lives, like other fathers we saw around us. We had to wait for him and learn to accept him as he was.
That's indeed a very understanding way of presenting him as a person who was larger than life and gifted, and therefore not only available to the family but also a very public intellectual that people looked up to. And you have a section in the book which is called Poets, Friends, Students and Family Remember. And in the book there are therefore many famous names of Indian poets and in fact Indian writers. For instance, Adil Jasawala, Geet Patel, Salim Piradina, Sujata Mathai, and many others. So what according to you are the dominant memories of Nissim Ezekiel and the literary influence that they present in their writing? I know you can't cover all of them, but if you can just share your impressions.
So since we have limited time, I thought I would quote directly from the words of three poets who share their dominant memories of my father's literary influence on their writing and even about their attitude to life. Salim Piradina says, one of the roles that Ezekiel has played all his life with the grace and honesty that have always been his mark is to put the subjectivity of new writers in a proper frame of reference. Since he started writing and publishing in the early 50s, Nissim Ezekiel has been widely acknowledged as the father of modern Indian poetry in English. Today he could be well regarded as the granddad of them all, the two generations of poets who have followed him, some of whom he nurtured and groomed, others who found in him a father figure to rebel against. Although 20 years hence the prospect of being labeled the grand old man of poetry might seem somewhat debilitating to him, there is no doubt that Ezekiel's contribution to the development of Indian poetry and to the cultural scene in general will be seen as a formative one. Adil Jasawala mentions that he was impressed by the exactness of thought in his prose and the concrete images of his verse. He also says he was warm and understanding as a friend, though they might have had different opinions on some matters. Menka Shigdapani writes, although through Nissim, I learned the importance of craft, the value of finding one's own voice as a writer, and the most fundamental lesson of all, that no matter how high one goes in life, one must always aim high. Geet Patel says, he demonstrated that good poetry has a lot of thought behind it. It was a lesson. I have been writing without thought. Geet and his wife Toni were my father's closest and dearest friends. There is a sorry, now it's your question. Yeah.
That's a very substantial and impressive summary of what some famous people have said about Nissim Ezekiel. But I want to come to your poetry, because you are very well known in your own field. And let's shift now to what your poetry is about, because there is a substantial section in the book which is called Daddy Poems. But it's also covering your own experiences, your innovations as a poet, your memories, and your impression of life wisdom. So would you like to tell us more about your poems in that context?
Sure. You also asked me to tell you a little bit about the poem that I've decided to read. This is the context actually. The loss of my father is as raw today as the day he passed away in January 2004. It's been difficult to find closure since I was not able to be with him in his last days. My brother had told me that he would not be giving me regular updates about his condition, but that I should remember him as he was and as I knew him. I requested my brother to ask my father if he remembered me. His response was, "Who can forget Kavita?" That was the trigger for this poem. It's hard to read it without getting emotional, but I will do my best. Poem Loss, dedicated to my father who sadly passed away from Alzheimer's in 2004. My father could not talk to me before he died, could not reach me in a distant land, twinned in spirit, separated by geography. I heard he remembered me, said he could never forget me. Memory without a memory, not able to remember, not able to forget, trapped in a maze of loss. Two losses. The greater loss is mine. Thankfully, he could not remember what he had lost.
Very touching, very touching. And it must have been very difficult time indeed for you to be separated from your father at that time. So we come to the final section of your book, and that comprises of interviews with you by various scholars and poets. I'm particularly interested in one of them, which is titled Carrying Her Father's Legacy. Kavita is the extension of Nissim Ezekiel's soul. Without necessarily citing just that one interview, may I ask you how you perceive the legacy of Nissim Ezekiel as a daughter and as a poet, and also because you are among our best-known Indian and diaspora writers?
Well, thank you so much for that, Manushree. I've answered a similar question in an earlier interview about my book, Light of the Sabbath, with Susmita Paul. I'm going to quote my words as they still hold true as a response. But first let me say that although I carry my legacy as Nissim Ezekiel's daughter, of course I'm happy to be acknowledged as part of the diaspora of Indian poets writing in English. The biological relationship with my father was never one of mere physical connection, his genes in mine. There was a powerful engagement with one another, total acceptance of the other, but also suffering in acknowledging the reality of the other's life, its strengths, weaknesses, sometimes uncaring, other times too involved, but never indifference. To me, that is the essence of love. Our souls will forever be connected in this way. I spent a lot of time writing about my father, giving readings of his poetry, lectures, and presentations about him. Preserving his legacy is very near and dear to my heart. I'm more than happy to introduce him to the younger generations of poets that may not be acquainted with him, as well as to international audiences. For me, this is a labor of love and more important than my own writing. Of course, I'm a published poet myself and enjoy writing poetry. I've taught poetry in schools and colleges in a teaching career spanning over 4 decades and published my first book, Family Sunday and Other Poems, in 1989. Raising 2 children and working full-time consumed the intervening years. I happily, but sometimes wistfully, put my writing on hold. Giving time to my family was important to me at that stage. It was a priority. After a long hiatus, having retired from teaching, I started writing again, and my chapbook, Light of the Sabbath, was published in September 2021. My simple desire is to share my most treasured memories and experiences with readers. My greatest reward is when the poems are well received and have touched the reader in some way. My poems are also a record in verse of my family history. On one occasion, my father, knowing my love of the Beatles, brought me a book of their lyrics from a bookshop in New York. He inscribed the book to Kavita with faith in her potential. If in some small measure I can fulfill that potential, then I have not only fulfilled his hope for me, but my own dream for myself.
Thank you very much, Kavita. You indeed have not only kept up his legacy and shown your wonderful potential and your experience as a poet, and a wonderful human being, if I may say so. I've known you for some time now. And on behalf of Sahitya Akademi, I'm indeed very grateful to you that you agreed to this interview across the geography that separates us. I wish you were here for the conference that we are holding in memory of Nissim Ezekiel. And thank you very much for all your contributions to our discussion.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the interview, and I must say that the questions were extremely inspirational, and it was a great pleasure working on them. Thank you, Manishri. I'll stop recording now. Okay?
Well, the inaugural session ends here. We will have a 10-minute break and get back for the first session, which will be chaired by Professor Anisur Rahmanji, and Sudeep Singhji and Manju Jaitaji will be the speakers. We will have a 10-minute break. Finally, I thank heartily Dr. K. Srinivas Raoji, Professor Malashri Raji for interviewing Kavita Ezekiel Menunka and Professor Nilokar Bharuchaji for so insightful inaugural address. Thank you all.